October 22 is a very significant day in the history of our beginnings.
Welcome back to the Adventist History Podcast. I am your host, as always, Matthew Lucio. And in this episode, we are talking about Desmond Ford, Part 6. That's right. We are plowing right along. Now, last time we talked about Desmond Ford and the Palmdale Conference. That was held, of course, in Palmdale, California. And we are dealing with the righteousness by faith controversy that took place during the 1970s. And after Palmdale, Des thought, well, hey, this more or less went my way. I've been, at least partially, cautiously vindicated, only to find out that Ken Wood, editor of the Review, as well as Russell and Colin Standish, saw things differently. And Russell and Colin Standish made it very clear in their book, and I wanted to say Creeping Compromise. I know it's not that book. It's close. Conflicting concepts of righteousness by faith. So they deal with Ford there. And also Ken Wood disagrees with Ford in his FYI articles for the Adventist Review. And so it became very clear that Ford's interpretation of Palmdale was not shared. And so it naturally led to the question, what did we just have a meeting for? If we all walk away from it thinking it affirms what we came to the meeting already believing, right? So, moving on, obviously the takeaway is that Palmdale failed to resolve the righteousness by faith controversy. And, of course, that, does that mean Palmdale was completely useless? No, maybe not. I think it's more, my perspective of it is it was just a missed opportunity to follow up and continue the conversation about these issues. You can't just meet once when you have two sides that are so deeply convicted about what they believe and hope that one meeting will solve everything. It didn't, and that it's not so much Palmdale, it's the failure to follow up on Palmdale, I think, that ensured Palmdale's ultimate failure to achieve a rapprochement with the parties involved. So, anyways, like I said, both sides walk away. They both feel vindicated by Palmdale. It's as if two different strains of Adventism are forming or have already formed and are just kind of armed by Palmdale. Anyways, there's some stories that emerged during this time as well. One Aussie couple had been Jehovah's Witnesses for 6 years before encountering Adventism. The husband of this couple did his due diligence. He bought Questions on Doctrine, as well as Walter Martin's book, The Truth About Seventh-day Adventism, so he could get both sides' perspective on Adventism, an insider and an outsider. Persuaded that Adventism was biblical and that the Trinity was the truth, because, Jehovah's Witnesses do not believe in the Trinity. So he adopts the Trinity. He went to Avondale and became a minister. But throughout the early 1970s, he was horrified to find Herb Douglas and others promoting the idea of Christ having a fallen human nature. The couple penned a letter to Robert H. Pearson, the General Conference president, with a single penetrating question that I wonder if a lot of people were wondering in those days, and that is this: what is happening to the church I joined 10 years ago? The former Jehovah's Witnesses concluded, quote, I could not support error just because it was advocated by leaders of Jehovah's Witnesses, and I cannot support error because it is advocated by some of our leading men, end quote. The notion that there might be two Adventisms was picked up by several people at the time. Noel Mason, another pastor down under and a Ford ally, also picked up his pen to write to Pearson. Mason believed the church had officially rejected the idea of a fallen nature of Christ when it approved and published Questions on Doctrine. So why is this issue coming up again in the 1970s? Quote, at a recent workers' meeting, we were exhorted to have a sense of loyalty to the denomination. The exhortation was made in the context of the current controversy within the SDA Church. I ask, to which church am I to be loyal? To the church of the 1950s and 60s, which spent thousands of dollars and as many hours defining the consensus of belief on the sinless nature of Christ, or to the Church of the 70s, which apparently condones a steady stream of literature opposing that view. End quote. Which church do I remain loyal to? The question couldn't have been put better by the traditionalists who wondered whether they were expected to remain loyal to the church of the pioneers or this emerging church these progressives and their quote-unquote new theology were creating. Which church do we remain loyal to? Now, the catalyst for these letters was, of all things, the adult Bible study guide, the Sabbath School Quarterly in 1977. This lesson was called Jesus, the Model Man. It was written by Herb Douglas, and it made statements like the following. Quote, Jesus entered the human family, taking the same nature as all other descendants of Abraham. And also, one of the primary results of the incarnation is that Jesus proved that men and women in their fallen condition, in connection with the same divine power that kept him from falling, can obey the law of God, thwart every satanic temptation, and truly glorify their heavenly Father's name. End quote. Now, I couldn't attempt to count the number of references here, but my hunch is, after reading this lesson, that there are more Ellen White references than Bible references. Now, if that's true, this wouldn't have surprised anyone. You remember that book I told you about some episodes ago, maybe last episode, I don't remember. It's called Perfection, the Impossible Possibility. That's the one where there's 4 authors, Herb Douglas, Heppenstall, Hans Larondel, and Mervyn Maxwell, and they all explain their own views of perfection. Well, a student at what is now Southern Adventist University counted how many times each author quoted the Bible and Ellen White. Now, I have not counted his count. I don't know if it's accurate because, look, I'm not going to spend all day counting references in a book, but by his count, Douglas quoted the Bible 47 times and Ellen White 101 times, okay? In other words, he quoted Ellen White twice as much as he quoted the Bible. Hans Larondel, with a very different view of perfection, quoted the Bible 232 times and Ellen White 4 times. Now, the progressives used this argument to suggest that the traditionalists were more concerned with Ellen White than biblical theology, and that the progressives were more interested in biblical theology than Ellen White or mere Adventist tradition. And I should say, how many times you quote a certain source is a rather amateur way to review ideas, and this is something that Robert Wieland himself pointed out. Quote, one scripture text truly elucidated is more weighty as evidence than thousands cited out of context, end quote. I think everybody would agree with Wieland here, right? It's not how many times you quote something that determines how strong your argument is. But this Southern student saw the imbalance of sources as part of a great problem. The difference over Christian perfection was not just a clash between progressives and traditionalists, but a clash between what we might say is biblical theologians and what he calls the Ellen G. White scholars. The student concludes, end quote, it cannot be doubted that sinlessness is not implied in the biblical concept of perfection. The impossibles, that is, those who believe sinless perfection is impossible in this life, have proven their point, yet they have largely ignored the spirit of prophecy writings in doing so, end quote. Now, again, I don't want to make too much about this, but I do think the student is getting at a larger reality that the progressive side was far more interested in what the Bible said, and the traditionalist side was more interested in what Adventist pioneers, including Ellen White, said. And, there's a reason for this, right? If you believe that Ellen White was a prophet, you can understand why people would say, why don't we get the latest update we've gotten from God, right? Not that there's anything wrong with Isaiah or Jeremiah, but hey, God spoke to us like 100 years ago from this lady. Why do we not listen to her? And so the thing is, though, that in listening to her, it seems that nobody had a perfectly, balanced ledger of sources that they used. Those traditionalists tended to use her a lot, and just if the count of references are any indication, were less worried about how to reconcile it with the Bible. So it's kind of, what's your starting point here? Is it Ellen White or is it the Bible? And it seems that both sides had a difficult time trying to reconcile what they found in the Bible or what they found in Ellen White with that other source. So the traditionalists had a hard time reconciling what they read in Ellen White with the Bible, and vice versa. And I think that does explain to a certain degree why it was so hard for these sides to talk to each other. Because it's almost like we're using two different books here, right? Not that the traditionalists didn't use the Bible, not that the progressives didn't use Ellen White, but we're clearly putting more weight on one source over the other. And so, how are we going to have a conversation here? Anyways, a Texas conference evangelist conveyed his frustrations to the General Conference about that Sabbath school lesson, saying that there was, quote, no greater heresy, end quote, and that this was, quote, the greatest doctrinal crisis we have ever faced in the church or ever will face, end quote. Roy Allen Anderson, one of the few to have a direct hand in questions on doctrine, quietly bemoaned the situation. Quote, all I hope is that with all of the discussion on this in our ranks at present, our evangelical friends will not hear of it, for it will place us back where we were for more than a century, end quote. And he makes it very clear that what he means is they will consider us a cult again. To the Texas evangelist, Anderson wrote, quote, after all the hard work some of us went to 20 years ago to lift the denomination out of the cult class, we are not turning back again to the errors, dare I say blasphemous errors, of some of our earlier writers, end quote. Ken Wood, editor of the Review, had his assistant respond to the Texas evangelist, quote, we believe that it is questions on doctrine that is at fault and not the Sabbath school lessons, end quote. H.M.S. Richards, the famous evangelist, apparently responded and said, quote, I understand that when one non-Adventist theologian saw these lessons, he waved them in the air and said, here we are with pure Jesuit theology from an Adventist publishing house, end quote. But a director at the GC Sabbath School Department stepped in to defend the lesson, saying that it had been distributed to 65 members around the world for review. It wasn't the result of one man's judgment. That means, Herb Douglas. And a Texas evangelist replied, that guy replied and said, well, if the Sabbath school lesson had been seen by 65 people, QOD was seen by 200 people. Fair enough. Douglas's lesson so agitated those who thought differently on the nature of Christ that one minister circulated a letter in June 1977 asking for the lesson to be withdrawn and for the church to make an apology for having released it. I grant you, this minister wrote to his colleagues, quote, that the majority of nominal Seventh-day Adventist ministers and laymen who are still on the milk bottle would not see this heresy, which I will soon point out. How is this heresy accomplished in the SS Quarterly? By belittling the divine nature of Christ, end quote. The minister was so agitated that he wrote something I'd never encountered before in all of my reading in Adventist history. Yes, he called the lesson heresy and diabolically dangerous. That kind of language appears often enough. But the minister went much further, much more graphically. He said, quote, to use the spirit of prophecy to support that nonsense is raping the gift of prophecy, end quote. And I'm honestly not sure what anyone can say in response to that. So let's just move on. At a Victorian conference camp meeting, a pastor suggested that Douglas's lesson not be printed and distributed in their territory. And while this idea was shot down, a number of other pastors, young and old, apparently agreed with him. Meanwhile, a series of articles in the Australasian Record advocated for the progressive understanding of righteousness by faith. One article blurted out that, quote, sad to say, many Adventists do not have that inward peace. Their experience of anxiety and lack of assurance reveals that their theology on what makes a man acceptable to God is foggy, end quote. How can one identify those who have a broken understanding of justification by faith? Well, the author of this article gives us some clues. First, quote, he is religious but not spiritual. Second, quote, he is more concerned with the rules than the Lord. Third, quote, he is more concerned with behavior than relationship. Fourth, quote, he thinks more in terms of sins than sin. Fifth, he fails to distinguish between morality and Christianity. You get the idea? This is the stuff I grew up hearing, right? It's not about religion, it's about a relationship. Or, don't be religious but not spiritual. Guys, this stuff has been said since at least the 1970s here, right? And every generation thinks they're the ones who are recovering those truths. But anyways, you get the idea. These slogans have been around for a little while. While words were flying across the Pacific, traditionalists and progressives continued taking speaking appointments all across Australia. Palmdale, of course, hadn't solved the controversy. In fact, it poured gasoline on it, or petrol, if you insist on being petulant or petroluent. That didn't work. Just forget I said that. Okay, anyways, curious thing happened. Autumn 1976. This is the most remarkable thing to me. And this is one of those moments in Adventist history I wish I could be there in person. And that is this, autumn 1976, Desmond Ford and Russell Standish met and talked in person, in public. You see, a man had invited Russell to his house in order to present his side of things. It's kind of like a little forum or informal symposium. And it's, hey, come present your side of things here before an audience. They'll have an opportunity to ask questions afterwards. It was a structured meeting. Russell did that in August, but then the same courtesy was extended to Desmond Ford in October. The concerned brethren, however, Russell among them, were also invited to sit in the audience for Des's presentation. And I don't find any evidence that Des was actually present at Russell's presentation. So, perhaps, I don't know, Des had more of a hostile audience. It wasn't a debate, okay? Russell wasn't sitting up there with him, and they were going to go back and forth. But there was a Q&A after Des's presentation where the concerned brethren could challenge Des in front of others, and Des would reply to them. Apparently about 70 to 80 people met in this home around 3 p.m. on a Sunday. Des repeated what he had basically said elsewhere and many times, that Avondale was teaching the gospel, and that when Paul uses righteousness by faith, he means justification alone. Okay, I don't think there's anything new said there. But Ford also responded to Standish and John Clifford's book, Conflicting Concepts. In fact, Des chafed at one particular claim in Conflicting Concepts, where they apparently pointed the finger at Des Ford when they labeled Ford's teaching, quote, the greatest attack on God's doctrine of sanctification in the whole history of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. These attacks have been vitriolic, personal, end quote. Des offered $5,000 to anyone who can prove that his attacks had been vitriolic or personal, and it wouldn't be long before during Des's talk, which, Q&A was supposed to be later, but Russell Standish nevertheless interrupted Des's presentation to challenge him. The questions and answer period is when things got good, but the conversation was really at times funny, tense, convoluted, but always fascinating. And that's why I wish I could be there. I do like the idea of Des offering money. That's a time-honored Adventist tradition from the 19th century where you're debating somebody, I'll offer so much money if someone can prove that Sunday is the Sabbath, this kind of stuff. No one I'm not sure if anyone's ever claimed any money. It's just kind of a way of saying put up or shut up, this is how confident I am in my position that I'm willing to part with so much money. But yeah, I think we've kind of grown out of the habit of doing such things. Anywho, so during Q&A, it really began with Russell trying to trap Des. Russell would read some statements from the SDA Bible commentary or some article, and say, I can stand by this 100%. Won't you stand by it too, Des? And Russell obviously knew perfectly well that the passage he was quoting is not something Des would stand by. The whole point was to force Des into a position where he would say something like, well, I'm against the review, or I'm against the Bible commentary, or I'm against the encyclopedia, right? To portray Des as if he's standing against what the church teaches. Des, of course, had his own publications he could support, saying, hey, I can support this statement. Can you support this, Russell? So he didn't really go down that road, but it was a pointless brinkmanship on Russell's part. But the attempts to trap Des did reveal a philosophical difference between the progressive leader and the traditionalist leader there assembled. Russell Standish kept trying to portray Des's views as recent innovations rather than historic Adventist positions, while Des argued that many historic positions had changed as new light came in. For example, the church had changed on the Trinity, on the nature of Armageddon, on the daily controversy. And so the reason why I have called Des and others like them progressives is not because they are theological liberals, as we understand theological liberals at this point, right? Des is not believing in evolution. He's not believing in, whatever, other things. But why do I call them progressives? Because they saw Adventism as something to be improved over time as their knowledge of the Bible grows. The traditionalists thought Adventists had it right in the beginning, and we've deviated from that path. And so Russell kept trying to point out that Des was not a 19th century Adventist, and Des kept urging them to try and be a 20th century Adventist. And so here's the dilemma, right? We're not speaking to each other. We're leaning more heavily on different sources in this debate, and really, different centuries for that matter. The exchange could get testy, like when Standish snapped that, quote, "It sounds as if you're more than able to defend the evangelical Protestants than the Adventists," end quote. Ford replied, quote, "No, Paul, not the evangelical Protestants, Paul," end quote. At one point, Standish introduces an anonymous letter from someone who was at Palmdale, and as well as someone who claimed to understand things the same way as Russell Standish did. Now, Des said he knew who wrote that letter, and that the author was not a theologian, and so therefore his opinion, was not necessarily determinative. And Russell Standish said, well, if you knew who wrote that letter, you might not be so bold in making that claim. And after a little back and forth, Des thought, hey, the people here have no idea what we're talking about. Let's just be out with it. And said the man who wrote that letter was our General Conference President, Robert H. Pearson. Eventually, other people were allowed to ask questions, and some of them were Des's friends and allies, like Lowell Tarling, who lobbed some softballs at Des in order to give Des an opportunity to set some things straight. But others of the concerned brethren, like John Clifford or J.W. Kent, spoke up enough that I think on the balance, most of the questions were probably hostile to Des. And now, like I said, there were jokes. There were moments of levity. When Russell Standish, who was, of course, a medical doctor, was apparently fumbling with his glasses trying to read an Ellen White statement, he read it as, "We must subdue a hasty temper. This isn't a premedicated," and Ford interrupted, "That was a medical term you were using." And Russell gamely replied, "That's right, premedicated." And the audience laughed. That was part of a discussion of how sin affects salvation. Ford had argued that it was persistent sin, not occasional sin, that threatens our salvation. Ford said, quote, "Suppose a dear lady, after she's said a cranky word to a child across the road to get something at the shop and was cut down by a car. Do you mean to say she is lost because she hasn't got time to say, 'God, I'm sorry'?" Standish replied, quote, "Well, where do you find in Scripture that she isn't?" End quote. Desmond Ford, quote, "Oh, brother, the whole tenor of Scripture," end quote. Standish shot back, quote, "In other words, sin does not separate us from God," end quote. Standish insisted that he wanted a future meeting where people from both sides could come and study this out together. But Adventist history is littered with desires for Bible conferences that never happened. Everybody who goes to a Bible conference says, we should do this again soon. Happened in 1919, it happened in 1952. It happens over and over and over again. They want more, and you seldom ever get a sequel. I wonder if Standish's desire for a conference was born out of frustration that the usual private correspondence failed to produce much fruit. Okay, these people talk to each other a lot more in letters than we find in articles or in other public venues. Before something was published or spoken in public, there was probably a dozen letters between the principal figures, many of which are probably lost forever. Thankfully, some of them are preserved, such as an exchange between Des and Erwin Gane, professor at Pacific Union College. Des and Erwin had known each other for some time, but it seems that this debate was the occasion for Des to get to know Erwin's son, Roy Gane. In a letter written on April 5th, 1977, Des explains his teaching on righteousness by faith to young Roy, who had evidently asked Des 4 questions. Now, Roy was young, and Des didn't bother getting into the weeds with him. Erwin and Des's conversation, on the other hand, was one of the more interesting exchanges on this topic that I've found. What made it interesting was how deep the two went into the timeline of the Protestant Reformation. Now, I don't know that I have all of the letters in this exchange, and I can't tell you right now where it began and where it ended, but in July 1977, Des admitted that, quote, Luther often used the term justify as Augustine did to make righteous, end quote. Now, just as a reminder, because it's been a while since we've talked about this, the debate over justification was, does it mean to declare righteous or to make righteous? Are you just being, does God just forgive your sins? They're forgotten. He says, you, dear sinner, have repented, you've embraced my son, and you stand before me as if you've never sinned. Right? That's God declaring us righteous. We're otherwise the same person as we were 30 seconds ago. So is God just declare us righteous, or does he actually make us righteous? Is there a change of our character in that moment that we come to Christ? Des, of course, was saying that we are declared righteous and that this is the essence of the gospel. This is the good news of the gospel, and that sanctification is the process of making us righteous. But here Des is admitting in this letter that Luther often used the term justify to mean to make righteous. Now, of course, he argued that the Bible used justification to mean to declare righteous, not to make righteous. But he admitted that Luther used the word in both senses. By the way, in an Adventist History Extra episode, I talked about how Christian history isn't so neat and tidy. Adventists aren't the only ones to use theological language loosely, so you can go check that out on the website or on patreon.com if you want to subscribe and listen to Adventist History Extra. What followed between the two was an array of quotes from Calvin's Institutes and the Luther works and back to Greek words. Des was clearly invigorated by how Gane was stretching him, and I don't think Des was flattering when he wrote, quote, I am learning from our discussion, let's keep it up, end quote. Gane did keep it up, and in his next letter he poured on quotes from various commentaries, Luther and Christian theologians and scholars of Luther, and one gets the impression that this is exactly the kind of exchange Des was hoping to have with the traditionalists. He wanted people who took scholarship seriously, people who didn't look down upon evangelicals, but were willing, or at least open, to learning from fellow Christians. But Gane did not come around to Des's views. He felt Des's exegesis was unconvincing, and he worried that this issue would divide the Adventist Church if Des kept pushing it. Erwin Gane said he was willing to compromise for the good of the church, however, if the evidence presented itself. But he was never convinced. The opportunity, it seems, never presented itself to him. And the relationship between Des and Erwin Gane would become more fraught as time goes on. Now, we need to just jump back just a wee little bit, because while this exchange of letters is going on in the summer of 1977, the Fords were being shipped out of Australia. The cause and the terms of Desmond Ford being sent away from Australia have been the subject of much debate. The rumor is that Erwin Gane was behind Pacific Union College's invitation for Des to come and teach there, but that Gane later regretted it and opposed Ford's arrival. Jack Castle, president of Pacific Union College, claims that Avondale asked for the transfer. No one knows for sure how Des ended up invited to come teach at Pacific Union College. Now, it's not hard to imagine why the brethren might want Ford out of Australia. They wanted things to calm down, and it was easier to move a church employee to America than it was to deal with a dozen concerned brethren who were almost all retired ministers or lay people. Moving a church employee is a transfer. Moving the concerned brethren is called kidnapping. And I'm told that the official church position on kidnapping is not positive. I guess I'll have to let that guy in my basement go now. I'll be right back. Anyways, The idea of sending Ford back to America had support outside of Australia. The GC Vice President, Duncan Eva, and John Staples, a member of the religion faculty at PUC, both came down to Australia in order to personally invite Des to come teach at Pacific Union College. Des wasn't exactly enthusiastic. He wanted two guarantees. First, that when his 2 years at PUC were over, he'd be allowed to return to his position at Avondale. Second, that he would be placed on the appropriate committees to work through problems with the sanctuary doctrine. Whether or not these two terms were granted became the source of finger-pointing and pain in the years to come. The Fords, of course, say that there was a deal, that these two things were promised to Des. Duncan Eva, the only one I think who could make these promises with some authority, later had apparently no memory of ever promising such things. But we do have a document from the president of Avondale to Des, February 21, 1977, where the president tells Des that the college board, quote, voted to accept the proposal from Pacific Union College that you serve as a lecturer on the exchange plan for 2 academic years. PUC have made this proposal on the understanding that you are re-employed in this division at the end of the 2-year period, and that we are happy to accede, end quote. What's more, the new chair of the theology department at Avondale would only be considered an acting head of the department. So that promise, at least, that first promise was written down, and it seems that this was understood and accepted. Gane wrote Des before the official vote, quote, I have taken the position that it would be unwise for you and me to be together in the same Bible department. Hence, I am opposing your coming to PUC. If our board votes to have you come, I will hand over my work to you and will take some other position, at least for the period of your stay, end quote. It was a sign of what awaited Des in America. Sure, he would have some of the biggest crowds waiting for him when he would go speak. I mean, they came to go hear him. They kept him busy. He would travel to speak nearly every weekend. But in crossing the Pacific to California, he would also be that much closer to Glacier View. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you again in the next episode. Hey, it's me again. If this episode didn't quench your desire for more Adventist history content, then go subscribe to Adventist History Extra. It's a private podcast that I do for those who support the Adventist History Project. You can get access to Adventist History Extra on the website, which is AdventistHistoryProject.org, or by becoming a patron at patreon.com. Now, there's more variety at Adventist History Extra, in case you were wondering. I do some interviews. Sometimes I do bonus episodes. We had a good episode here in the Adventist History Podcast, and I want to talk some more about it. Other times, I go behind the scenes at conferences I attend, like the Women in Seventh-day Adventist History Conference. What's more, just as a second announcement for you, Michael Campbell and I are leading a bus tour in October 2024. So, if you want to go drive around New England a bit, see the sights and have some fun, well, you can sign up for our bus tour newsletter, once again, at AdventistHistoryProject.org. And we're going to keep you up to date there about what you need to know to go and sign up for that and all of that. So just to be very, 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 very clear, we don't have a sign up for the bus tour itself, but it's a sign up for the newsletter so you can stay informed about the bus tour, so I don't have to make announcements every single time and interrupt these episodes and all of that. That's where those announcements are going to be. So if you're interested, head on over to the website. You can sign up for the bus tour newsletter over there. Okay, I think that about does it. Thanks again for listening.